In general, my task here is to talk about the context in which these decisions have to be made. So I want to talk about the economic situation and the fiscal situation, and those are very closely intertwined. Generally, when a state has a weak economy, it's also going to have difficult fiscal situation. Although what Illinois' particular history has been is that even when we've had a strong economy, we haven't managed the fiscal situation terribly well, and that's contributed to some of our problems. So I want to talk first about Illinois' economy, and people sometimes lose sight in the kind of doom and gloom of the fact that Illinois actually is a pretty strong state. It's historically had this just shows the median household income in Illinois, and it's historically been above the national average. That's the red line, and the blue line is the U.S. national average. And what you can see there is that we fluctuate around the national average, and sometimes we soared significantly above it, other times we're much closer to it. But I don't think, in looking at this picture, what you get is kind of a death spiral. Right now, Illinois is not doing, it's a little bit better than the national average, but not doing terribly well. But one of the things that we have to remember is that typically in recessions, Illinois does worse than the national average, or that is, it feels recession somewhat harder. But then in boom periods, it does somewhat better. So anyway, the Illinois economy has been mostly better than the U.S. economy, but in recent times we have some real pause about that. This shows the unemployment rate in Illinois and the nation as a whole. And what you see here is, again, the Illinois unemployment rate tends to track the nation as a whole. But the kind of frightening thing is, if you look at us from 2011, and particularly beginning in 2013, the Illinois unemployment rate is significantly above the national unemployment rate. And so there's some real cause for concern about whether we're diverging from historic patterns, which has been to be kind of a little bit higher income state than the rest of the country. In particular, what we've seen is the lack of job growth in Illinois. So this shows the civilian labor force and employing non-farm payrolls over the past several years, from before the Great Recession in 2008 until recent times. And what you see is that, like the rest of the country, Illinois lost a lot of jobs in 2008 with the Great Recession. But the rest of the country, we can see employment coming back. Illinois, we don't see employment coming back very much. And in particular, again, starting in the beginning of 2013, we see continued job losses in Illinois while the rest of the country is picking up. So a real concern is whether, Illinois' economy has again diverged from its historic patterns, and whether it's in more trouble than it's been in the past. There's been a lot of ink about why this might be. One concern is that the general fiscal situation, and in particular sort of the pessimism about the fiscal situation, has led to some of these kind of job losses, the instability and the pessimism about the fiscal situation. It's difficult to say with any kind of scientific precision that that's what's causing the dismal economic performance, but it's at least a potential, it's certainly a threat to the economy. So now turning to the fiscal situation, this is a graph that we spent a lot of time producing in the Fiscal Futures project. And what this graph shows is the state's fiscal balance. And you notice what we say is Illinois consolidated funds up there. One thing that you have to realize when you think about state fiscal situation is that it's a complicated picture. The state is got an account it calls the general fund account, which is essentially its checking account. That's the money that's about half of the money it's spending, roughly about $35 billion right now. But it also has many other accounts. These accounts typically house things like federal funds. They house funds for transportation and many other funds. And often the news media and even many government reports focus on the general funds. We don't think that's a wise decision because it's easy to get confused. Funds often transfer, or spending often transfers between the general funds and the consolidated funds. And we therefore think it's important to look at a consolidated funds budget and to look at it in a very consistent way over time. So this graph represents a lot of work looking at government accounting reports and making sure they're consistent over time. And what you see here is a very volatile picture, but in general a negative picture. The lines below zero, which is almost all of the graph, show deficits. That is, the state is spending more than it's taking in revenues. And we see two periods where we see massive deficits around 2000 and also around 2010. We see huge deficits, and then we see some recovery. This line, by the way, includes projections, so you might notice it goes all the way out to 2023. Obviously, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Up to 2014 or so, it's about 2013, it's actual data. But what we see is that we project deficits in the future based on historical experiences. We're actually in a relatively good period right now where we're closer to budget balance than we've been in a long time. We have deficits on the order of $1 or $2 billion for the current fiscal year. But those deficits we expect are going to increase, and they're going to increase largely because the tax rate, the state personal and corporate income tax rates, are scheduled to go back down beginning in January of 2015, and also because the historical experience is that spending grows faster than revenues. This shows a lot more detail on major categories of spending and sort of what's happened historically. Now, this is all historical data, and there's a lot of numbers and colors on there. But I want you to get the basic picture. The big blue chunk at the bottom is Medicaid. And you can see that that is rising. And it varies some, but that's a big chunk of government spending, and it's been rising over time. The second one, the orange chunk, is K-12 education. These are both very important, vital services that the government provides. The Medicaid one will rise more rapidly in the future because of the ACA and the increased roles of people on that program. But those expenditures are, supporting very vulnerable populations. K-12 education is a vital piece of expenditures for the state. And you can go through the other individual categories, but I think you should see that it's going to be very hard to cut spending without really cutting into things that we care a great deal about. So looking at the revenue side of the picture, in the next slide, this shows the major revenues. And one of the things that's often not realized when we look at revenues is the great importance of federal source income, which is the blue chunk at the bottom. That federal source income is partly Medicaid spending, largely Medicaid spending, but also federal grants for transportation and many other sources. And it's a very large share of our overall revenue, something about which we have limited control, and something about which we may have trouble in the future because the federal government faces its own fiscal crisis and is trying to control the increased spending. The other two major sources of revenue that the state has are the individual income tax and the state sales tax, the orange and the green chunks there. And of course, the individual income tax the rate is scheduled to fall, and that is something that will, is a major source of revenue, put us in difficult fiscal situation. The green section, the state sales tax, is also is growing very slowly because the types of goods that we apply the sales tax to, which are basically tangible goods, misses a large fraction of growth in the economy, which is services. And so the sales tax base is getting narrower and narrower, and Illinois has a particularly narrow sales tax base, so that those revenues are not going to grow very fast. So when we look at the fiscal future of the state of Illinois, we see revenue sources that are primarily slow growing, with the exception of the income tax, and we see expenditures that are focused on areas that are, probably will grow fast in the future, for which the need is growing, and that makes it very difficult to get a sustained budget balance, particularly in light of a political system that doesn't do a lot of long-term planning, and so isn't grappling with the sort of long-run issues in our fiscal situation. We aren't the only ones to notice this. This shows the bond rating agencies. There are 3 bond rating agencies, and the red blocks illustrate downgrades in the bond rating, Illinois' bond rating. And what you can see is that Illinois, over the past decade and a half or so, has experienced a long line of negative ratings and downgrades. It's now got, I believe, the lowest bond rating of any state in the country. And this, I don't think, represents the idea that the state is going to default, but it's generally a negative picture, and it's not so much a negative picture of the economy of Illinois, but a negative picture of the sort of political will to come up with a plan to have a long-term, sustainable kind of budget. And I think, connecting this to the sort of economic trends that I started out talking about, the concern is that this kind of pessimism about the fiscal situation could also lead to pessimism about the economic situation, and that could be a sort of self-reinforcing negative cycle that we're quite concerned about. So we've written a lot about this. There's a lot of things on our website. Chris mentioned the budget toolbox. There's also many articles elsewhere on that website, particularly in the fiscal futures section of it. And we often go back and deal on a regular basis with issues as they arise. We'll continue the project at least through next year, and so try and give updates and information about the biggest fiscal and public policy debates. So thanks for your attention, and that's our website where you can get more information.